A herd of gemsbok stands frozen around a single muddy hole that used to be a lake. The water has turned the color of tea, and it is shrinking by the hour, and every animal within 20 miles already knows exactly where it is. So does the man crouched in the tree line with a fire-hardened spear, and so do the lions resting half a mile downwind, waiting for the same thing he is. This is not the worst week of a drought. This is an ordinary afternoon in the middle of one. And for someone trying to feed a family with nothing but a wooden shaft and patience, it is somehow the easiest and the most dangerous day of the year to make a kill. Ancient hunters did not simply lose their prey during a drought, so much as inherit a completely different set of rules for finding it. Herds that had spread across hundreds of square miles during the wet season collapsed down onto a handful of shrinking pools. Grazing animals that could normally survive a missed meal now had to drink every single day or die, which meant their movements became almost embarrassingly predictable to anyone paying attention. And that is the real puzzle sitting at the center of this story. How did a species with no store of food, no way to irrigate a field, and no guarantee of rain for months at a time keep hunting, keep eating, and in some documented cases keep thriving, while the actual landscape around it was dying of thirst? If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The answer turns out to have very little to do with toughness, and a great deal to do with reading an entire ecosystem under stress and using that stress as information. Drought did not just take resources away from ancient hunters. In narrow windows, it handed them advantages a wet, easy season never could, before it turned around and tried to kill them too. The obvious assumption is that drought simply meant starvation, and there is truth sitting right inside that assumption. When rain fails for a full season, plants stop producing the seeds, tubers, and fruit that made up the bulk of most hunter-gatherer diets, and the animals that eat those plants either move on or start dying themselves. Body fat on surviving herds drops fast. Milk production in nursing mothers fails, which means young animals die at higher rates, which means fewer of them for hunters to find the following year. None of that is in dispute. Skeletal remains from arid regions across Africa show exactly this pattern repeating across dry cycles going back hundreds of thousands of years. Thinner bones, smaller adult body size, and infant mortality spikes that line up precisely with known periods of low rainfall. What that assumption misses is the timing. A drought is not a single flat event that gets steadily worse until everyone starves. It has stages, and the earliest and middle stages of a serious dry spell often did something almost nobody expects. They concentrated animals into small, exposed, highly visible locations. And for a hunter who understood that pattern, the early and middle months of a drought could be some of the most productive hunting of the entire year. The real story of ancient hunters and drought is not a straight line down into starvation. It is a curve, up briefly before it turns down hard, and the way people manage that curve is where the real engineering of survival shows up. Modern wildlife biologists studying the Serengeti ecosystem have documented the same curve happening today. As surface water disappears, herbivore density around remaining waterholes can rise several times over, compared to wet season baselines, packing animals that would normally never cross paths into the same narrow strip of mud and grass. Ancient hunters were reading that exact signal thousands of years before anyone wrote it down as ecology. The first sub-question worth asking is the most practical one. If the animals are all crowding into the same handful of locations, why didn't a hunter just walk up and kill one? A waterhole during a drought is not an easy target. It is the most watched, most defended, most contested piece of ground for miles around. Predators know the pattern too, and they arrive early and stay late. So instead of walking straight up to open water, ancient hunters positioned themselves along the paths animals were forced to take to reach it. The narrow game trails funneling through brush, the choke points between dunes, the single crossing point on a nearly dry riverbed. That required knowing the terrain intimately enough to predict where an animal would pass before it did, and it required a weapon capable of delivering a fatal wound from close range without a long chase across open, exhausting ground. That second requirement is where some of the oldest solid evidence for planned, drought-adapted hunting comes from. At a site called Kathu Pan in the northern Cape of South Africa, archaeologist Jane Wilkins and her colleagues examined stone points roughly 500,000 years old and found damage patterns, specifically impact fractures at the tips, that only show up when a point is driven into something with real force behind it, consistent with use as a hafted spear tip rather than a handheld cutting tool. 500,000 years ago is deep enough in time that the toolmakers were not yet fully modern humans. The region itself sits in one of the driest parts of southern Africa, a landscape where seasonal water scarcity would have been a constant fact of life rather than an occasional crisis. Finding deliberately engineered killing weapons in exactly that kind of environment tells you something important. Ambush hunting near unreliable water was not a desperate improvisation invented once famine hit. It was a standing strategy, refined over an enormous stretch of time, specifically because dry seasons kept making it necessary. The landing point here is worth sitting with. A spear tip built to punch through hide at close range meant a hunter did not need to outrun an antelope across open ground in the worst heat of the year. He needed to be patient, positioned correctly, and willing to wait motionless for hours in cover near a trail he had scouted days in advance. Waiting cost almost no water. Chasing cost an enormous amount of it. In a landscape where every liter of sweat mattered, the entire hunting strategy bent itself around minimizing unnecessary movement while maximizing the one moment that counted. But ambush hunting solved only part of the puzzle, and it came with its own brutal limitation. A hunter hidden by a shrinking waterhole was relying entirely on an animal choosing to walk past his exact position, and during the driest stretches, even that could not be counted on forever. Herds sometimes broke their normal patterns entirely, scattering unpredictably in search of any water at all, which meant the predictable ambush point of last month could go completely empty for weeks. When the water itself became too unreliable even to stake out, hunters needed an entirely different tactic, one that did not depend on the animal coming to them at all. That different tactic is persistence hunting, and it depends on a piece of human biology that shows up again and again across the story of how our species handles extreme heat. Humans sweat through millions of glands spread across nearly the whole body, while most four-legged prey animals cool themselves mainly by panting. Panting works fine at a walk or a light trot. It becomes far less effective once an animal is running flat out, because the same muscles used for breathing hard are also being used to run, and the two demands compete with each other. A human, moving upright with an efficient sweating system, does not have that conflict. He can breathe steadily, and run steadily, and cool himself steadily, all three at once, for hours. In the early 2000s, researcher Louis Liebenberg spent years documenting this firsthand among sand hunters in the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa, work later published in the journal Current Anthropology in 2006. He followed hunters as they selected a single kudu, or gemsbok, out of a herd, usually one already stressed by heat and thirst, and simply ran it down. Not sprinting. A steady, relentless jog held for hours across open, superheated ground, tracking the animal by its prints, its droppings, the bend of disturbed grass, even the specific gait pattern pressed into the sand that told an experienced tracker exactly how tired that particular animal already was. Eventually the antelope, unable to stop and pant long enough to cool its rising core temperature, would begin to stagger. Its body was overheating from the inside, in a way panting alone could never fully solve, while the man behind it, soaked in sweat and steadily losing heat the whole time, kept moving. Hans Liebenberg documented this way, sometimes stretched past 30 kilometers and lasted more than 5 hours before the animal finally collapsed from heat exhaustion and could be killed at close range with almost no risk to the hunter at all. Here is what makes this strategy specifically drought-adapted rather than just generally clever. It works best precisely when conditions are at their worst. An animal already dehydrated from weeks without reliable water starts a persistence hunt with far less thermal reserve than it would have during a wet, food-rich season, which means it overheats faster and the chase ends sooner. The very conditions starving the hunter's community were simultaneously weakening his prey's ability to escape him. That is a genuinely strange trade sitting inside the middle of a drought, one that rewarded the species built to sweat and punished every species built to pant. None of this made persistence hunting easy or safe for the hunter himself. A 5-hour run across cracked, sun-baked ground in extreme heat demanded exactly the kind of water reserves a drought made hardest to spare, which meant a hunter attempting this had to be almost perfectly hydrated before he even started, and confident enough in his own knowledge of hidden water sources along the route to risk the attempt at all. Miscalculate that, and the hunter could end up in exactly the same fatal condition as the animal he was chasing. This was never a free strategy. It simply traded one form of risk for another, betting a hunter's own body against his prey's, and counting on human physiology to win that specific bet more often than it lost. The danger in that trade was not only thermal, it was also four-legged and had teeth. Every hunter converging on a shrinking waterhole during a drought was walking into competition with the exact same predators relying on the exact same concentrated prey, and unlike modern hunters, ancient humans were not always the most dangerous animal at that water's edge. Lions, hyenas, and leopards were drawn to the identical bottleneck for the identical reason, and a hunter who had just spent hours running an antelope to exhaustion could easily arrive to find a pride of lions had beaten him to the kill, or worse, could find himself and his own kill suddenly the target of an ambush from something far stronger than he was. Paleoanthropologist Robert Blumenschein spent years studying exactly this dynamic by observing modern predator and scavenger behavior on the Serengeti plain and applying those patterns back onto the fossil record from East African sites dating back nearly 2 million years. His research, published in the Journal of Human Evolution, showed that dry seasons did something counterintuitive to carcass availability. As grazing quality collapsed and water grew scarce, weaker animals began dying of starvation and dehydration on their own, independent of any predator kill at all, and their carcasses often sat exposed on open ground for hours before big cats or hyenas found them. That window, the gap between an animal dying naturally and a large predator claiming the body, was frequently large enough for an opportunistic hominin to reach the carcass first, strip whatever meat remained, and more importantly, smash open the leg bones for the marrow inside, a calorie-dense resource most other scavengers lacked the tools to access at all. This complicates the simple picture of drought as pure hardship. In the specific months when die-offs were climbing but had not yet peaked, a drought landscape could briefly deliver more accessible calories per hour of searching than a healthy wet season ever did, precisely because so many weakened animals were dying faster than predators alone could consume them. Marrow bones cracked open with a simple hammerstone offered fat and protein that plant foods during a drought simply could not match, at a moment when hunters needed every calorie they could get. But that same abundance sat right next to enormous risk, and the two never fully separated from each other. A carcass valuable enough to be worth the walk was almost always valuable enough to attract a hyena clan or a territorial lion as well, and stone tool cut marks found layered directly on top of tooth marks at several East African sites, rather than underneath them, suggest hominins were sometimes arriving at a kill after the original predator had already fed and moved off, taking their chance during a brief window rather than confronting the animal directly. Other sites show the opposite layering, cut marks first and tooth marks after, meaning the reverse also happened regularly, hominins claiming a carcass and then losing what was left of it to something stronger. Drought hunting was never a simple story of human cleverness overcoming an empty landscape. It was closer to a dangerous, constantly shifting negotiation over a shrinking pool of resources, with several other species competing for the exact same narrow window of opportunity, and the humans in that negotiation did not always win. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. When even the marrow ran out, and the ambush points near the last waterholes had already been picked over by every hunter and predator in range, the response among ancient foragers was to widen the entire definition of what counted as food. Archaeologists call this the broad spectrum shift, and one of the clearest windows into how it worked comes from research by archaeologist Mary Steiner, who examined thousands of animal bones recovered from cave sites around the Mediterranean, spanning tens of thousands of years. Steiner found something that at first looks like a simple change in taste, but is really a direct signature of environmental stress. In older, less pressured layers, the bone assemblages were dominated by large, slow-breeding animals, like red deer, the kind of prey that delivers a huge amount of meat per kill, but takes a population years to recover after being hunted hard. In later layers, tied to periods of documented resource scarcity, those large animals became rarer in the debris, while small, fast-breeding prey, tortoises, partridges, rabbits, and shellfish, became dramatically more common. That shift matters because small, fast prey is genuinely inferior in almost every way that counts to a hungry hunter. A tortoise or a partridge delivers a fraction of the calories of a single deer for the same or greater effort spent catching it. Optimal foraging models built by ecologists predict this kind of switch happens only when the preferred, higher-value prey has become too scarce or too costly in time and risk to reliably pursue, forcing foragers down what researchers call the diet breadth ladder towards smaller, less efficient, but still catchable food sources. In plain terms, hunters were not choosing tortoises over deer because tortoises tasted better. They were catching tortoises because the deer were gone, and a slow, ground-bound animal that could not run, could not gore you, and could be collected in daylight without any real chance of losing a fight to a predator became worth the trade despite its tiny calorie return. This broadening extended beyond the animals themselves into how those animals were processed. Bones from these stressed periods show far more complete breakage and marrow extraction than bones from more prosperous layers. Evidence people were working every last usable calorie out of each individual catch, rather than discarding partially used carcasses, the way you might when food is genuinely plentiful. Shellfish middens from the same stressed periods pile up in far greater volume, showing intense harvesting of a food source that offers relatively little energy per hour spent collecting it. Exactly the kind of low-return, low-risk fallback a population turns to once the higher-value options have thinned out around them. The uncomfortable truth sitting inside this evidence is that broad-spectrum foraging was rarely a lifestyle choice. It was closer to a forced retreat, one small step down the ladder of efficiency at a time, each step representing a slightly worse trade between effort and calories than the one before it. Widening the diet kept people alive. It did not do so cheaply, and it never fully replaced the lost value of the large game that had once made survival easier. Eventually, in the very worst and longest droughts, even that widened diet was not enough, and the only remaining option was a landscape most people would not think to look at all. That landscape was the coast, and the story sitting at Pinnacle Point on the southern tip of South Africa may be the single most extreme case of drought-forced adaptation in the entire human record. Around 164,000 years ago, much of the African interior was locked in one of the most severe glacial period droughts our species has ever faced, part of a marine isotope stage known as MIS-6. Evidence from ancient pollen, dust cores, and lake sediments across the continent points to interior regions turning into hyper-arid desert for extended stretches, with grasslands and the large game they supported collapsing across huge portions of the landscape that had once supported growing human populations. Archaeologist Curtis Moran, working with an international team, excavated a cave complex at Pinnacle Point, overlooking the Indian Ocean, and published his findings in the journal Nature in 2007. What he found, in sediment layers dating to precisely this period of continental-scale drought, was a thick, dense accumulation of shellfish remains, brown mussels and whelks, pulled directly off the intertidal rocks below the cave, alongside heat-treated stone tools shaped with a level of precision not otherwise seen this early in the archaeological record. His interpretation, since supported by additional coastal sites nearby, is that a small population of early modern humans survived one of the harshest droughts in our species' history by retreating to a narrow, resource-rich strip of southern African coastline, where the ocean tide delivered a reliable source of protein twice a day, regardless of what the rain was doing inland. This matters far beyond one cave. Genetic studies estimating human population size around this period suggest our species came dangerously close to extinction during this exact stretch of prehistory, with some researchers proposing the entire surviving population may have numbered only in the low thousands, clustered into a small number of refuges just like this one. If that estimate holds even approximately, then the shellfish stacked up in the sediment at Pinnacle Point are not simply evidence of clever foraging. They may be part of the reason any of us exist to read about it at all. What makes this the hardest possible case is that shellfish gathering required abandoning almost everything that had defined big game hunting up to that point. There was no waterhole to ambush, no antelope to chase across open ground, no marrow to crack from a fallen carcass. Instead, survival meant learning an entirely new set of skills, reading tide patterns written in the pull of the moon rather than the tracks of an animal, timing low tide precisely enough to gather before the water returned, and understanding which shellfish beds could be harvested sustainably enough to keep producing food for years rather than being stripped bare in a single desperate season. That last detail carries real weight. Analysis of shell size across these layers shows remarkably consistent harvesting patterns over long stretches of time, suggesting these early coastal foragers were managing the resource carefully rather than simply grabbing everything in sight. A level of long-term planning a species on the edge of starvation might not be expected to manage at all. The landing point of this entire segment is stark. When the interior of an entire continent dried up around them, the difference between extinction and survival for our species may have come down to a strip of rock a few dozen meters wide, twice a day, at low tide, and the discipline to harvest it without destroying it. Not every population facing chronic drought had a coastline to retreat to, and in the deserts of the Near East, a very different solution eventually emerged. One built not around individual skill, but around large-scale cooperation and permanent infrastructure. Beginning roughly 9,000 years ago and continuing for millennia afterward, communities across what is now Jordan, Syria, and the surrounding region began constructing enormous stone-walled funnel structures, now known as desert kites, named for their shape when viewed from above. These structures, some stretching more than a kilometer in length, used two long converging walls of piled stone to guide entire herds of migrating gazelle toward a narrow enclosure or a steep drop, where waiting hunters could kill dozens of animals in a single coordinated event, rather than relying on the unpredictable success of one hunter tracking one animal. French archaeologist Rémy Cressard and colleagues working on what became known as the Global Kites project used aerial and satellite imagery, first captured by pilots flying over the region in the 1920s, and later refined with modern remote sensing, to map thousands of these structures across the desert, revealing a scale of coordinated construction earlier researchers had badly underestimated. Building a kite required an enormous amount of communal labor invested before a single animal had ever been caught. Walls stacked from loose desert stone, stretching for hundreds or even thousands of meters, positioned with clear knowledge of gazelle migration routes that could only have come from generations of careful observation. That investment only makes sense as a response to genuine, recurring scarcity. A single hunter with a spear can gamble his own effort on one stalk or one chase. A community building a stone funnel a kilometer long is making a very different kind of bet, one where dozens of people commit real labor over real time, because relying purely on individual hunting skill during a drought-stressed migration had apparently stopped being reliable enough on its own. Some of the densest concentrations of these structures cluster in exactly the arid zones where rainfall was least predictable, and where wild gazelle herds, driven by the same water scarcity affecting every other species in this story, were forced into narrower, more predictable migration corridors as reliable grazing land shrank elsewhere. The same underlying pressure driving ambush hunters to smaller water holes and pushing foragers in the Mediterranean toward tortoises and shellfish was also pushing entire desert communities toward permanent, large-scale infrastructure, designed to guarantee a bulk kill during the narrow migration windows drought, made increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. The kites represent something genuinely different from every other strategy in this story. Ambush hunting, persistence hunting, and scavenging were all things one determined, skilled individual could pull off alone or with a small group. A kite stretching across a kilometer of desert floor could only be built, maintained, and used effectively by a community large enough and organized enough to coordinate labor across weeks of construction, and then again during the brief, critical hours of an actual drive. Drought did not just change what people hunted or how far they were willing to run. In some regions, it changed the scale of human cooperation required just to keep eating at all. Step back across all of these strategies, and a pattern becomes visible that no single site or study captures on its own. Ambush hunters near Kathu traded movement for patience. Persistence hunters in the Kalahari turned their own sweat into a weapon against a stressed and dehydrated animal. Scavengers on the Serengeti learned to read a narrow window between a death and a predator's arrival. Foragers around the Mediterranean widened their diet one small, low-value species at a time. A small refuge population on the South African coast may have kept our entire species alive by learning to read a tide. Communities in the deserts of the Near East eventually answered the same pressure by building infrastructure that outlasted any single hunter's lifetime. None of these were separate inventions arrived at by accident. Each one is a different answer to the same underlying math problem: how to keep converting scarce, unpredictable resources into enough calories to survive another season, using nothing but knowledge of animal behavior, human physiology, tides, and terrain accumulated and passed down across generations who had never met each other. What changed from region to region was not the underlying pressure, it was the specific tools each community had available to answer it, shaped by whatever coastline, desert, grassland, or waterhole happened to be within reach. There is a version of this story still playing out today, in communities across East Africa and the Horn of Africa, where prolonged drought continues to force this same kind of adaptation. Herders shifting to smaller and more drought-resistant livestock, foragers widening their diet the same way Steiner's data shows, happening tens of thousands of years ago. The pressure has not gone away. Only some of the tools available to answer it have changed. The single fact worth carrying out of this entire story is the one sitting in the sediment at Pinnacle Point. A population small enough that geneticists still argue over exactly how close to zero it came, kept alive in part by shellfish pulled off wet rocks twice a day, while an entire continent dried up around them. That is not a story about clever tricks or survival hacks. It is a story about a species that refused to stop eating, no matter how completely the rules of eating kept changing underneath it. Every strategy in this story, the ambush spear, the persistence run, the cracked marrow bone, the tortoise shell, the tide, the kilometer of stacked desert stone, was built by people who had never seen a written record of what worked before them, and would never know whether what they were trying would actually work again next season. They tried anyway, failed often enough to leave the evidence of that failure sitting in cave layers and shell middens for archaeologists to find, and kept adjusting until enough of it worked, often enough, for long enough, that their descendants are the ones telling this story now. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.